For decades, Tracy Reiner smiled for the cameras as Hollywood royalty, the adopted daughter of legendary director Rob Reiner, raised inside a world most people only see from red carpets and award shows. But behind the polished image, the famous last name, and the fairy tale access to fame, Tracy says there was a truth so complicated, so emotionally layered, that she stayed silent about it for years. Until now. When Tracy finally opened up, fans weren't ready. Because this wasn't a story about privilege alone. It was about identity, belonging, and the quiet confusion of growing up in a household where the world assumes you have everything while you're still trying to figure out who you are. According to Tracy, being raised by Rob Reiner wasn't just about Hollywood dinners and famous friends. It was about navigating expectations she never asked for, comparisons she couldn't escape, and a sense of gratitude that sometimes made it hard to admit when things felt overwhelming. What shocked people most wasn't bitterness, it was honesty. Tracy spoke about the pressure of carrying a legendary name without the biological connection people assumed, about constantly being reminded how lucky she was, even during moments when she felt lost or invisible, about loving her father deeply, while still struggling with the weight of growing up in someone else's spotlight. Social media reacted instantly. Some praised her courage. Others said, "How could that life be hard?" But that reaction only proved her point. Because Tracy's truth isn't about attacking Rob Reiner, it's about dismantling the myth that fame automatically equals emotional safety. And once she started talking, fans began realizing this wasn't just a celebrity story. It was a human one. The kind that makes you rethink what it really means to grow up fortunate and what it costs to finally tell your story when the world thinks it already knows it. For most of her life, Tracy Reiner existed inside a story everyone thought they already understood. The adopted daughter of Rob Reiner, Hollywood royalty. A child raised in privilege, protection, and opportunity. That version of the story was neat, flattering, and easy to digest. And for years, Tracy let it stand, not because it was fully true, but because challenging it felt impossible. According to Tracy, the pressure to be grateful started early. Not in a cruel way, not with malice, but with an unspoken expectation that followed her everywhere. You are lucky, so don't complain. You are chosen, so don't question. You are loved, so don't struggle. And when those messages surround you from childhood, they shape the way you learn to silence parts of yourself. Tracy has been clear that her relationship with Rob Reiner was real, loving, and foundational. He wasn't a distant figure or a symbolic parent. He showed up. He cared. He provided stability. But what people rarely talk about, she says, is how complicated it can be to grow up adopted in a family the world puts on a pedestal. Because when everyone assumes your life is perfect, there's very little room to admit when it isn't. She described feeling caught between identities. Not fully part of the biological lineage everyone talked about. Not fully outside it either. Introduced as Rob Reiner's daughter, she was constantly measured against a legacy that existed long before her, a legacy she respected but never chose. The name opened doors, yes, but it also closed conversations she desperately needed to have. Tracy recalled moments growing up when people spoke about her life in front of her, as if she weren't there. Statements like "she's so lucky" or "can you imagine growing up like that?" followed her into rooms, schools, and social circles. Over time, she internalized the idea that any confusion, sadness, or insecurity she felt must be a personal failing. Because how could someone with her life feel anything but grateful? Inside the house, things were loving, structured, and safe. But Tracy says safety doesn't cancel complexity. Being adopted meant constantly navigating questions of origin and belonging, even when those questions were never asked out loud. She wondered about where she came from, what parts of herself were inherited versus learned, and whether those curiosities made her ungrateful. Often, she chose silence instead. As she got older, the weight of expectations shifted but never disappeared. In public, she was expected to represent the family well, poised, appreciative, uncomplicated. In private, she wrestled with wanting to be seen as herself, not as an extension of someone else's success. She loved her father, but she didn't always love the shadow that came with his name. Tracy described a subtle loneliness that surprised even her. Not isolation, she was surrounded by people, but a sense that her inner world didn't quite fit the story being told about her. Friends assumed she had answers she didn't have. Strangers assumed access meant understanding. And when she tried to explain that things weren't always easy, the response was often dismissal disguised as praise. "You're so fortunate. At least you never had to worry." Other people would kill for that life. Those comments, she says, taught her to minimize herself. One of the hardest parts was learning how to voice conflict without sounding ungrateful. Any attempt to talk about discomfort felt like betrayal, not just of her family, but of the narrative everyone celebrated. Tracy learned to edit her feelings, to soften her truths, to package everything in gratitude so no one felt uncomfortable. Over time, that habit became automatic. She also spoke about the challenge of forging her own path. With a famous last name, every decision felt scrutinized. Success was attributed to privilege. Failure felt amplified. There was little room to simply be average, to experiment, to grow privately. Her identity felt pre-written in ways she didn't always know how to escape. What shocked many listeners was how long Tracy carried these feelings quietly. Not because she was hiding something dark, but because she didn't believe her story was allowed to be complicated. She had been taught, implicitly, that complexity would be seen as complaint. So she waited. She lived. She matured. She built her own understanding of family, love, and self-worth outside the noise. When she finally chose to speak, it wasn't with anger. It was with clarity. She wasn't exposing Rob Reiner. She wasn't rewriting history. She was adding nuance to a story that had been flattened by fame. And that distinction mattered deeply to her. She emphasized that love and difficulty can coexist. That gratitude doesn't erase identity questions. That privilege doesn't immunize a person from confusion or longing. Her truth wasn't a rejection of her upbringing, it was an expansion of it. As this first layer of her story reached the public, reactions were immediate and divided. Some praised her honesty. Others questioned why she needed to say anything at all. And that reaction, Tracy noted, was exactly why she had waited so long. Because the world is comfortable with simple stories and deeply uncomfortable with ones that live in between. What she shared wasn't scandalous. It was human. And for the first time, Tracy Reiner allowed herself to exist outside the version of her life everyone thought they knew. But this was only the beginning. Because once you start unpacking identity, belonging, and silence, you inevitably arrive at harder questions about voice, autonomy, and what it costs to grow up inside someone else's legend. And those questions, Tracy hinted, were the ones she had avoided the longest. As Tracy went deeper, the story shifted from quiet reflection to something far more revealing. Because once she began talking about identity, she couldn't avoid talking about silence, and how learning to stay quiet became a survival skill long before she understood why she needed it. She explained that growing up in Rob Reiner's world meant being surrounded by adults who were powerful, accomplished, and deeply respected. Conversations were big, opinions were strong, success was the norm. And in rooms like that, a child learns quickly how to read the temperature, when to speak, when to smile, when to disappear into the background so you don't disrupt the rhythm. Tracy said no one explicitly told her to be silent. That's what made it harder to explain. The expectation wasn't enforced with rules, it was enforced with atmosphere. With praise when she fit the image, with subtle discomfort when she didn't. Over time, she learned which parts of herself were welcomed and which parts created tension. One of the most complicated truths she shared was about gratitude becoming a cage. She was grateful, genuinely. She knew she had been given opportunities most people never see. But gratitude, when it becomes the only acceptable emotion, leaves no room for anything else. Sadness feels like betrayal. Anger feels like disrespect. Confusion feels like weakness. She recalled moments in adolescence when she struggled emotionally and didn't know how to name it. Normal teenage insecurity mixed with adoption-related questions, magnified by constant visibility. When she tried to articulate that discomfort, she often found herself minimizing it mid-sentence, laughing it off, or redirecting the conversation so no one would worry, or worse, judge. Tracy also spoke about comparison, a theme that followed her everywhere. Not just to Rob Reiner, but to the idea of what his daughter was supposed to be. People expected confidence, ease, ambition, and gratitude wrapped neatly together. When she didn't feel those things naturally, she assumed something was wrong with her. She described walking into rooms where people already had opinions about her before she spoke. Some saw her as privileged and untouchable. Others saw her as lucky, but unearned. Very few saw her as simply human. That constant projection made it difficult to develop an internal compass. When the outside world tells you who you are loudly enough, you start to doubt your own voice. As she entered adulthood, the pressure didn't disappear, it evolved. Tracy felt a growing urgency to define herself outside the family narrative, but every attempt felt tethered back to the same origin story. Interviews led with her last name. Introductions framed her identity through Rob Reiner. Even well-meaning curiosity felt intrusive. She admitted there were times she resented the simplicity of how others viewed her life. Not the people themselves, but the assumption that access equals fulfillment. That being loved publicly means you're fulfilled privately. That stability cancels longing. None of those things, she said, are true. The hardest part to admit was that she didn't always feel seen. Loved, yes. Supported, yes. But seen as a full person with contradictions, doubts, and unmet needs, not always. And that realization took years to surface because she had been taught by culture, not family, that love should be enough. Tracy was careful to draw that distinction. She didn't frame Rob Reiner as controlling or dismissive. She framed the environment as overwhelming. Fame creates gravity. It bends conversations, expectations, and emotional space without anyone intending harm. When one person's presence carries weight, others instinctively adjust. She also talked about the isolation that can exist inside privilege. Resources solve many problems, but they don't answer existential questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What parts of me are inherited, and what parts are chosen? What do I owe the story I was adopted into, and what do I owe myself? Those questions lingered quietly for years. What finally shifted things, she said, was motherhood. Becoming a parent forced her to confront the parts of herself she had learned to minimize. She began thinking about what it means to raise a child with both honesty and protection. How to offer gratitude without erasing struggle. How to create safety without silence. That reflection brought clarity and grief. Grief for the version of herself that didn't know she was allowed to take up space emotionally. Grief for the conversations she didn't know how to start. Grief for the years spent editing herself for comfort. When Tracy finally decided to speak publicly, it wasn't impulsive. It was intentional. She had spent years separating blame from truth, anger from honesty. She didn't want to accuse. She wanted to explain, to show that loving families can still be complicated and that adoption stories don't end at gratitude. The public reaction surprised her, even though it shouldn't have. Some people responded with empathy, sharing their own experiences of growing up adopted or growing up in the shadow of someone else's legacy. Others responded with disbelief, insisting she should simply be thankful and move on. That response stung, but it also validated her silence, because it proved her point. We are comfortable celebrating outcomes. We are far less comfortable examining the emotional cost of how those outcomes were achieved. Tracy's story challenged the idea that being chosen erases the need to choose yourself later. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't rewriting history. She was claiming ownership of her internal life, something she realized she had deferred for far too long. As she shared more, it became clear that the crazy part of her story wasn't scandal or dysfunction. It was how invisible emotional complexity can be when it exists inside privilege. How easily people confuse access with peace. How often adopted children are expected to perform gratitude instead of being allowed to process identity. This chapter of her truth unsettled people because it refused extremes. It wasn't a takedown. It wasn't a fairy tale. It lived in the gray space, where love and longing coexist, where appreciation and pain don't cancel each other out. And as Tracy continued to speak, one thing became undeniable. She wasn't telling this story to change how people saw Rob Reiner. She was telling it to finally be seen herself. But that choice came with consequences, questions she knew would follow her words, and expectations she could no longer control. Because once you break a long-held silence, the world doesn't just listen. It responds. And Tracy was about to find out just how loud that response could be. By the time Tracy reached the final layer of her truth, the conversation had shifted again, this time away from her childhood and toward the present. Because once you name the silence you were raised in, you're forced to confront how that silence shaped the adult you became. And for Tracy, that realization was both liberating and destabilizing. She admitted that for years, she confused peace with compliance. If things were calm, she assumed she was doing the right thing. If she felt discomfort, she assumed she was the problem. That mindset followed her into relationships, friendships, and professional spaces. She became skilled at adapting, at reading rooms, at making herself easy to be around, even when that meant shrinking. Tracy spoke about how long it took her to recognize that this pattern wasn't personality, it was conditioning. Growing up in a world where emotions had to be managed carefully taught her that expressing too much could feel disruptive. so she learned to regulate herself before anyone else had to. That skill served her in some ways, but it also came at a cost. She rarely asked for what she needed. What changed, she said, wasn't a single event, it was accumulation. Years of small realizations stacked on top of each other. Therapy conversations where she kept circling the same themes. Moments of frustration that didn't make sense until she traced them back to being told, implicitly, that gratitude should override discomfort. Slowly, she began to understand that her story didn't start when she was adopted. It continued every time she chose silence over honesty. Speaking publicly was the final step in a private process that had already been underway. Tracy didn't decide to tell her story to shock anyone. She decided to tell it because she was tired of carrying it alone. And because she realized that staying quiet no longer protected anyone, it only kept her small. The reaction to this part of her truth was the most intense. Some people applauded her clarity, saying it took courage to speak without blame, to acknowledge love while still naming pain. Others accused her of being ungrateful, of rewriting a story that didn't need revision. A few even suggested she should have kept it private, as if privacy were something she hadn't been practicing for decades. That criticism hit a nerve, but it didn't break her. Instead, Tracy reframed the conversation. She made it clear she wasn't asking for permission to feel. She wasn't seeking validation for her pain. She was simply refusing to continue pretending that complexity doesn't exist just because a life looks good from the outside. She also addressed the assumption that telling her truth somehow diminished Rob Reiner. It didn't. In her words, loving someone doesn't require erasing yourself. Honoring a parent doesn't mean abandoning your own emotional reality. Two things can be true at the same time, and refusing that nuance is what keeps people stuck. What resonated most with audiences was her discussion of choice. Tracy said that being adopted is often framed as a single moment, a rescue, a blessing, a happy ending. But for the adopted child, it's an ongoing process of choosing who you are, again and again, in the context of someone else's story. That process doesn't end in childhood. It shows up in adulthood, in parenthood, in identity. She spoke about how freeing it felt to finally choose herself without apology, to stop explaining why her feelings made sense, to stop preemptively softening her words so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. That freedom, she said, didn't come from anger. It came from acceptance of herself, of her past, and of the fact that not everyone would understand. The most powerful moment came when Tracy acknowledged that telling her story might change how people see her forever. Some would never look at her without questioning her gratitude. Others would project their own experiences onto hers. She accepted that risk, because the alternative, continued silence, felt heavier. In doing so, she modeled something rarely seen in celebrity families: emotional autonomy without destruction. No accusations, no exposés, just truth spoken calmly after years of thought. That restraint made the story more unsettling to some, because it couldn't be dismissed as drama. It was measured, and that made it real. As the conversation settled, Tracy's story began reaching people far beyond Hollywood. Adopted adults, children of famous parents, anyone who grew up being told their feelings didn't align with their circumstances. Messages poured in from people who felt seen for the first time, not because their stories were identical, but because the emotional logic was familiar. That's when it became clear this wasn't just about Rob Reiner, or fame, or adoption. It was about what happens when we confuse good outcomes with good experiences, when we assume love cancels pain, when we expect gratitude to replace processing. Tracy's truth challenged all of that quietly, without demanding agreement. And perhaps the most radical part of her revelation was this: she didn't ask anyone to take sides. She didn't need villains to tell her story. She didn't need conflict to validate it. She simply needed space to name what had always existed beneath the surface. In the end, what people called crazy wasn't dysfunction or scandal. It was the idea that someone could grow up loved and still struggle. That someone could be adopted into privilege and still wrestle with belonging. That someone could honor their parent while reclaiming their own voice. Tracy Reiner didn't expose a secret. She exposed a myth. The myth that certain lives are too fortunate to be complicated. The myth that gratitude is the same as fulfillment. The myth that silence is the price of belonging. And by telling her truth on her own terms, she proved something quietly powerful. You don't have to burn the house down to finally step out of its shadow. Sometimes, all it takes is telling the story the way you lived it, even if the world thought it already knew the ending. If you've stayed with this story until now, It's because something about it hit deeper than celebrity headlines. This wasn't about tearing anyone down. It was about finally hearing a voice that had been living in the background for decades. Stories like Tracy Reiner's don't explode with scandal. They unfold with honesty, and that's exactly why they matter. Now we want to hear from you. Did Tracy's truth change how you think about adoption, privilege, or growing up in the shadow of a powerful name? Have you ever felt pressure to be grateful instead of honest? Drop your thoughts in the comments, not for drama, but for connection. These conversations don't happen often, and they shouldn't end here. Make sure you like this video so it reaches people who need to hear it, and subscribe with notifications turned on. When more stories like this surface, the kind that challenge assumptions and add depth to narratives we thought were simple, you'll want to be part of that conversation from the beginning. Because sometimes the most important truths aren't loud, they're the ones that finally get spoken.